Hi, and thanks for watching the RPG channel. Today I'm going to be talking to you about narrative combat. And narrative combat is different from the other video I did about tactical combat because in narrative combat you're not necessarily worried about counting squares and dealing with line of sight and the actual position of each individual combatant in the fight. And instead what you're trying to do is integrate the battle into the overall story that's taking place and focusing on that aspect of it rather than worrying about the nitty-gritty of system details and things like that. Games that use narrative combat tend to be more rules-light games that don't necessarily even have rules for tactical combat, like one of my favorite games actually, which is the Dragonlance Saga Edition for the 5th Age. But most games can be run with narrative combat. It's just a question of the group's individual taste in the matter. Now, while you're not going to be counting squares and dealing with line of sight and cover and flanking and stuff in quite the same way you would be if you were running a more tactical combat, that still doesn't give you an excuse to make boring combat encounters. In fact, when you're trying to use narrative combat, it's actually more important to make the fights exciting and interesting because you want those to be part of the story. So, one of the first things you need to think of when you're placing a combat situation in a game that uses narrative combat is what role you want it to play in the overall story. Because in these types of games you're not going to just throw in a combat encounter. You want it to do something to the story that's taking place where it adds some element of drama or excitement or something like that, and you can't just rely on the fact that people are getting to kill things to take their stuff to be the driving point here. So one of the first things you want to think about with running a narrative combat is the location of the fight. And you want these locations to be rather cool and interesting places where if you were watching a movie or listening to a story or something like that, you would be interested in the action that's taking place in this location. You know, you're not wanting to put it in a generic featureless area, but instead try to come up with some place that by itself is exciting and then have a fight taking place there to make it even more interesting. So let's start with an example of like a pirate ship maybe. Okay, so you have the pirate ship and the area of the fight is probably going to be mostly on the deck of the ship. So let's divide that into different areas here because we're not having to deal with individual distance and things like that, but you still want the location to seem unique and you want the players to be able to interact with the area that they're fighting within. So let's divide this pirate ship into a main deck, a upper deck, and then let's add a lower deck. So there's 3 different areas where combat can be taking place on this ship. Okay, actually I guess there's 4 areas where combat can be taking place on this ship. And after you've done that, you can start working on how these areas are related to each other. And the reason you do that is because even if you're not, you know, like sitting there with a grid, like mapping all this stuff out and showing exactly where each player is, you want them to be able to kind of picture what's going on in their head. So let's have it where the combatants down on the main deck have the possibility of being knocked down that big hole in the middle and getting stuck on the lower deck. Now the players can move freely between the upper and the main decks, but they can't make melee attacks against people in different areas. So you're not going to have a sword fight between someone down on the lower deck and someone who's on the upper deck. But they can move freely between those areas unless something happens to restrict the movement, like the storyteller or whoever could say that there's an enemy standing blocking the stairs, and if a player wants to move from one deck to another, they're going to have to deal with that enemy or find some creative way to get around them. So you've got the lower deck where you can fall down into the main deck where you can fall down into the lower deck area. Then you've got the upper deck, and let's say that the railing or something is weird on the upper deck, and players up there have the chance of getting knocked off the ship and might wind up overboard. Players that are overboard can climb back up on the ship and wind up back on the main deck, and players who wind up down on the below deck area can climb up and get to the main deck. So actually it winds up looking kind of like this. So now that you've got all that taken care of, the rest pretty much writes itself, because you don't have to necessarily worry about the nitty-gritty details of like where every single crate and cannonball on the deck of the ship is. So just add the starting locations for the enemies, and then let the players do whatever it is they want to do. But remember, in a game like this, it is focused on more narration and storytelling than it is on tactics and planning and stuff, so you want to encourage the players to be inventive, and if they're in the right spirit for it, then they're going to come by that naturally. So try to go into it with some idea about how you want the fight to go and how you can make it an interesting location and things like that, but don't be surprised when something happens in the fight that causes you to have to think of the fight in a completely different way, and possibly even adding entirely new zones to the battlefield pretty much on the fly. And if you can get the right group for it and you have the right game that supports this kind of play, it can be a lot of fun. And I will talk to you next time. Thanks.
Oh God, what would be a good